She stole my wedding ring and said dead people don't need jewelry anymore. When I discovered my daughter-in-law had taken the ring I'd worn for 47 years, the symbol of the greatest love of my life, I realized some betrayals cut deeper than any grief. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The absence hit me like a physical blow, though it took a moment for my mind to process what my eyes were seeing. The small ceramic dish beside my kitchen sink, the same pale blue dish James had bought me for our 10th anniversary, sat empty for 47 years. Oh, that dish had held my wedding ring every evening while I washed the dinner dishes. Oh, the same ritual I'd performed thousands of times since we were newlyweds, fumbling through our first meals together in this very kitchen. I stood frozen at the sink, my hands still dripping with soapy water, staring at the empty dish as if I could will the ring back into existence. The thin gold band with its modest quarter-carat diamond had been on my finger when I went to bed last night. I was certain of it. The familiar weight of it, slightly loose now after 47 years of wear, had become so much a part of me that I sometimes forgot I was wearing it at all. But I always removed it for washing dishes. James used to tease me about this habit, saying I treated that ring like it was made of spun glass instead of gold. "It's tougher than you think, Maggie," he'd say, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Survived 47 years. With you, didn't it?" The memory brought tears to my eyes, as thoughts of James often did these 6 months since his death. But this wasn't the familiar ache of grief. This was something sharper, more urgent. This was panic. I dried my hands and began searching, methodically checking every surface in the kitchen. Oops. I'd set it down somewhere else in a moment of distraction. Grief had made me forgetful lately, or so everyone kept telling me. Perhaps I'd placed it on the counter while preparing my solitary dinner, or left it by the coffee maker while fixing my morning cup. But the ring wasn't on the counter, or by the coffee maker, or on the windowsill where I sometimes placed it while watering my plants. I expanded my search to the living room, checking the end tables, the mantel, the bookshelf where I kept my reading glasses. Nothing. My chest tightened as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom James and I had shared for nearly 50 years. The master bedroom felt too large now, too empty, but I'd been unable to bring myself to sleep in the guest room. I searched the dresser top, the nightstands, the jewelry box that had been my mother's. I even checked the bathroom, though I knew I'd never removed my ring there, as the minutes stretched into an hour. Then, too, a cold certainty began to settle in my stomach. The ring wasn't lost. It was gone. Someone had taken it. But who? Lived alone now. Had lived alone since James passed in April. The only people who'd been in my house recently were family, my son Michael, my daughter-in-law Diane, and my precious granddaughter Emma. The thought that one of them might have taken my ring felt like another death, another loss too devastating to contemplate. I sank into James's favorite chair, the one I'd been unable to move or donate despite well-meaning suggestions from Michael and Diane. The leather was worn smooth where his hands had rested, and I could still catch the faint scent of his aftershave if I breathed deeply enough. This chair had become my refuge in the months since his death, the place where I felt closest to him, As I sat there, trying to think rationally through my growing panic, I remembered Diane's visit 3 days ago. She'd come by ostensibly to check on me, as she did every week since James's funeral. But something about her behavior had struck me as odd. She'd been unusually interested in my jewelry, asking questions about what pieces had sentimental value and which ones might be financially significant. "Margaret, you really should put your valuable pieces in a safety deposit box," she'd said, standing in my bedroom doorway while I folded laundry. "It's not safe to keep expensive jewelry in an empty house. What if someone broke in?" I'd found the suggestion peculiar. My jewelry wasn't expensive by any reasonable standard, mostly pieces James had given me over the years. Meaningful to me, but hardly valuable enough to tempt burglars. And my house wasn't empty. It was simply quiet, the way homes become when they house only one person instead of two. "I don't really have anything worth worrying about," I'd told her. "Everything I own has more sentimental value than monetary value." She'd picked up my jewelry box then, opening it to examine the contents with an appraiser's eye. "This wedding ring of yours, though that diamond might be worth something, you should have it evaluated." The memory made my skin crawl. At the time, I'd attributed her interest to practical concern, the kind of efficiency that had made her successful in pharmaceutical sales. Diane was always organizing something, always looking for ways to optimize and improve situations. But now, sitting in James's chair with my bare finger feeling like an open wound, I wondered if her interest had been more calculating than caring. I reached for the phone and dialed Michael's number, my hands shaking as I pressed the buttons. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing today?" His voice carried the careful concern that had become standard since his father's death. The tone adults use when speaking to elderly relatives they're not quite sure can manage on their own. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." A pause. "Of course, Mom. What's wrong?" "My wedding ring is missing. It's not lost. It's gone. Someone took it from my kitchen." "Were you or Diane or Emma here recently without telling me?" Other pause, longer this time. "Mom, are you sure you didn't just misplace it? You've been under a lot of stress lately. And sometimes when we're grieving, I didn't misplace it, Michael." The firmness in my own voice surprised me. "I've been taking that ring off in the same place every night for 47 years. Was in the dish last night, and it's not there now. Okay, let me think. Diane stopped by a few days ago, but you were there. Emma hasn't been over since last weekend. Have you checked everywhere? Maybe you put it somewhere else and forgot." I didn't forget. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I'm not some confused old woman who can't remember where she puts things. Someone took my ring. I could hear him discussing something with someone in the background, Diane, presumably. They were talking in the hushed tones people use when they think they're dealing with someone who's not quite rational. "Mom, Diane thinks maybe you should talk to someone about this. Grief can affect our perceptions sometimes," and I hung up the phone. The casual dismissal felt like a slap. My own son, the child I'd raised and loved and supported through every challenge of his life, was treating me like a confused elderly woman whose concerns couldn't be trusted. The implication that grief had made me delusional stung worse than the theft itself. But it also clarified something for me. If Michael wasn't going to help me find my ring, I'd have to find it myself. I called Diane's cell phone directly, my heart hammering as it rang. "Margaret, hi. Michael just called me. He's worried about you. He said you think someone stole your wedding ring." The false concern in her voice set my teeth on edge. There was something performative about it, as if she were reading from a script about how to talk to distressed elderly relatives. "Diane, I need you to tell me honestly. Have you seen my wedding ring? Have you been in my house when I wasn't here?" "Oh, Margaret, honey, I think you might be more upset about this than you need to be. Sometimes when we're dealing with loss, we can get confused about where we put things. Have you checked your jewelry box? Oh, maybe you put it somewhere different and just forgot." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost doubted myself. Had I put the ring somewhere else? Was grief affecting my memory more than I realized? But then I looked down at my left hand, at the pale band of skin where my wedding ring had lived for nearly half a century, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong. "Diane, I need you to answer my question. Have you seen my wedding ring?" A slight pause. "Margaret, I think you need to take some time to calm down and think about this rationally. You're obviously very upset, and that's understandable. But accusing family members of theft I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm asking a simple question about whether you've seen my ring." "Hush. No, Margaret, I haven't seen your ring. Hush. And I think maybe you should talk to someone about these kinds of concerns. There are professionals who help people deal with grief-related confusion." The condescension was breathtaking. Diane was suggesting I needed psychiatric help because I'd noticed that my most precious possession had disappeared. She was using my age and my recent loss as reasons to dismiss my legitimate concerns. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and tried to think clearly. Diane's responses had been evasive, deflective, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. She'd immediately suggested that I was confused, that grief was affecting my judgment, that I needed professional help for what she characterized as paranoid delusions. But I wasn't confused. I knew exactly where I'd left my ring, just as I'd known every night for 47 years. Someone had taken it, and based on the evidence, that someone was most likely Diane. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, I called Robert Chen, the attorney who'd handled James's estate and had been our family lawyer for over 20 years. Robert was 70 himself, a contemporary who'd never treated me with the patronizing concern that had become so common since James's death. "Margaret, what can I do for you?" I explained the situation, the missing ring, Diane's evasive responses, the immediate assumption that I was confused or delusional. Robert listened without interrupting, then asked careful questions about the timeline, the evidence, and my certainty about the ring's location. "Margaret, what you're describing sounds like theft, possibly by a family member. That's always a delicate situation, but it's also unfortunately common. People sometimes assume that elderly family members won't fight back or won't be believed. If they make accusations, what can I do? First, we need evidence. If Diane took the ring, there will be a trail: financial records, insurance claims, possibly online sales if she's trying to convert it to cash. I'd like to recommend a private investigator who specializes in these kinds of family situations. Idea of hiring a private investigator to spy on my own daughter-in-law felt surreal, like something from a television drama rather than my quiet life as a retired librarian. But it also felt like the first concrete action I could take, the first step toward proving I wasn't a confused old woman imagining things. Sandra Martinez arrived at my house 2 days later, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd spent 15 years as a police detective before opening her own investigation firm specializing in family theft and elder abuse. "Mrs. Callahan, I want you to know that what you're describing is more common than you might think. Family members often target elderly relatives because they assume the victims won't fight back or won't be believed if they do." She took detailed notes about the ring, its appearance, its history, when I'd last seen it, who had access to my house. She asked for photos of the ring, which I was able to provide from family gatherings over the years. "Your daughter-in-law's immediate suggestion that you're confused or need psychiatric help is a red flag," Sandra said. "That's a common tactic used by people who are guilty of theft. They try to undermine the victim's credibility before the victim can build a case against them." "But what if I am confused? What if grief has affected my memory more than I realize?" Sandra looked at me with the direct gaze of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between truth and deception. "Mrs. Callahan, you've given me precise, detailed, consistent information about your routine, your ring, and the timeline of events. You're articulate, rational, and clearly competent. A thing about this conversation suggests that you're confused or unreliable." The validation meant more to me than I could express. For days, I'd been doubting my own perceptions, wondering if everyone else was right about my diminished capacity. Sandra's professional assessment that I was thinking clearly restored some of my confidence in my own judgment. What happens now? Now? I investigate. I'll look into your daughter-in-law's financial situation, her social media presence, any online sales activity. If she took your ring, there will be evidence. Sandra's investigation took 2 weeks, and what she discovered was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Diane had been selling jewelry on various online platforms for the past 6 months, using descriptions like estate pieces and vintage finds to market items that were clearly personal jewelry rather than genuine antiques. More damaging. Sandra found an Instagram photo on Diane's account from 5 days after my ring had disappeared. The photo showed Diane's hand wearing what appeared to be my wedding ring, with a caption about loving the vintage look of this piece. "Mrs. Callahan, I need you to look at this photo carefully and tell me if this is your ring." A light. I studied the image on Sandra's laptop screen, my heart racing as I recognized the familiar shape of the diamond. The specific pattern of tiny scratches on the band where it had rubbed against James's ring for decades. There was a small chip on the diamond's edge that James had always said gave it character. Hey, and I could see that same imperfection in Diane's photo. "That's my ring," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's definitely my ring." The photo was posted 6 days ago with location data showing it was taken at her home. "This is pretty conclusive evidence that she's in possession of your stolen property." Looking at the photo of Diane wearing my wedding ring felt like watching someone desecrate James's grave. She was flaunting the theft, posting it publicly as if my most precious possession was just another fashion accessory she'd acquired. What do we do now? Now we confront her with the evidence and demand the ring's return. If she refuses, we file criminal charges for theft. This photo gives us everything we need to prove she took your property. The confrontation took place in Sandra's office 3 days later. I'd asked Michael to come as well, hoping that seeing the evidence might help him understand that his mother wasn't a confused old woman making paranoid accusations. Diane arrived dressed in her typical professional attire, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged or caught in a lie. She greeted me with the same false warmth she'd shown since James's death. As if we were meeting for coffee rather than to discuss her theft of my wedding ring. Margaret, I'm glad you decided to get some professional help with these concerns, she said, settling into the chair across from Sandra's desk. I think once you work through your grief with proper support, you'll realize that these kinds of suspicions aren't healthy or realistic. Sandra opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Diane. Ms. Patterson-Williams, I'd like you to look at this photograph from your Instagram account and explain how you came to be wearing Mrs. Callahan's wedding ring. The change in Diane's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confident smile vanished, replaced by something calculating and cold. She studied the photo for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, searching for an explanation that might salvage the situation. I don't know what you think you're seeing, but this is a completely different ring. I bought this at an estate sale last month. Mrs. Callahan, can you point out the identifying characteristics that prove this is your ring? I moved closer to the screen, my heart hammering as I pointed out the distinctive scratch pattern. The small chip in the diamond, the particular way the setting sat slightly askew after 47 years of wear. Every mark and imperfection was exactly as I remembered, as familiar as my own face in the mirror. Diane, that's my ring. I know every scratch, every mark. Wore that ring for 47 years. You're wrong, Diane said, but her voice lacked conviction. Lots of old rings look similar. You're seeing what you want to see because you're desperate to blame someone for your own forgetfulness. Sandra placed a magnified printout of the photo next to a family photo from the previous Christmas that clearly showed my ring in detail. The scratch patterns were identical. The diamond chip was in exactly the same position. Even the way the band had worn thin in specific spots was perfectly matched. The forensic evidence is overwhelming, Sandra said calmly. This is definitely Mrs. Callahan's ring, okay? The question now is how you came to possess it and whether you're going to return it voluntarily or whether we need to involve law enforcement. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Michael sat beside me, staring at the evidence with growing comprehension and horror. I could see him beginning to understand that his wife had not only stolen from his mother, but had then systematically tried to convince everyone that his mother was delusional. All right, Diane said finally, her voice taking on a different tone, harder, colder, devoid of the false sympathy she'd been projecting. Let's say hypothetically that I did take the ring. What's the big deal? Margaret doesn't need it anymore. James is dead. She's never going to remarry. The ring is just sitting there collecting dust while she sits around feeling sorry for herself. The casual cruelty of the statement hit me like a physical blow. This woman had not only stolen my most precious possession, but genuinely believed that I had no right to keep it because my husband was dead. Dead people don't need jewelry anymore, she continued, looking directly at me with something approaching contempt. And neither do their widows. You should be grateful that someone is getting some use out of it instead of letting it go to waste. Michael gasped beside me, but I found myself speechless. The depth of Diane's callousness, her complete inability to understand the sentimental value of the ring, her assumption that widowhood somehow forfeited my right to my own possessions, was breathtaking in its cruelty. You think I don't need my wedding ring because James is gone? I managed to ask. That's exactly what I think. You're clinging to the past instead of moving forward. That ring represents a life that's over, a relationship that ended. Keeping it is just pathetic sentimentality. That ring represents 47 years of love, of partnership, of building a life together. It's not pathetic sentimentality, it's the most important symbol I have of the most important relationship of my life. Diane rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. Margaret, you're 74 years old. How much more life do you really have left? What's the point of holding on to sentimental objects when you could be helping family members who actually have futures to build? The mask had fallen away completely now. This wasn't about practical financial planning or helping me move forward from grief. This was about Diane's belief that elderly people, particularly elderly widows, had no right to their own possessions or autonomy. I was meant to be grateful that she'd relieved me of the burden of my own sentimental attachments. Where is my ring now? I asked. I sold it, she said with a shrug. I needed the money, and you didn't need the ring. It seemed like a practical solution to both problems. The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. My wedding ring, the ring James had placed on my finger 47 years ago. The ring that had been present for every moment of our marriage. Every joy and sorrow and ordinary day we'd shared was gone forever, sold to a stranger for whatever money Diane had needed to cover her debts. But then Sandra opened another folder and pulled out additional photographs. Actually, Ms. Patterson-Williams, our investigation suggests that you haven't sold the ring yet. These photos from yesterday show you still wearing it. You've been posting about it on social media as recently as this morning. Diane's face went white. She'd been caught in another lie, and this one revealed the depth of her manipulation. Hadn't sold the ring out of desperate financial need, she'd been wearing it, flaunting it, treating my most precious possession like a trophy she'd won by successfully gaslighting a grieving widow. I want my ring back, I said quietly. You can't prove it's your ring, Diane said. But the defiance sounded hollow now. Sandra placed the forensic comparison photos on the desk again. I think we can prove it quite conclusively. And if you continue to refuse to return stolen property, Mrs. Callahan is prepared to file criminal charges. Theft from an elderly person is a felony in this state, and judges tend to take these cases very seriously. The legal threat seemed to penetrate Diane's arrogance in a way that emotional appeals hadn't. She was a pharmaceutical sales representative with professional licenses to maintain, and a career that couldn't survive a criminal conviction. Fine, she said, pulling the ring from her finger with obvious reluctance. "Take your precious ring. But you're making a mistake holding on to the past like this. You need to accept that your life with James is over and start living in reality." As she placed my wedding ring on Sandra's desk, I felt a wave of relief so profound that tears sprang to my eyes. The familiar weight of it, the warmth from her skin still clinging to the metal. The way it caught the light exactly as I remembered having it back felt like recovering a piece of my soul that I'd thought was lost forever. I slipped the ring back onto my finger, where it settled into the groove it had worn over 47 years. The fit was perfect, the weight exactly right, the sensation of completeness immediate and overwhelming. "There's one more thing," Sandra said to Diane. "We'll need you to sign a statement acknowledging that you took Mrs. Callahan's ring without permission and that you've returned it voluntarily to avoid criminal prosecution. You want me to admit to theft? We want you to acknowledge what happened so there's no confusion about the facts if this matter comes up again in the future." As Diane reluctantly signed the statement, I looked at my son, who'd been silent throughout most of the confrontation. His face was pale with shock and shame, and I could see him processing the reality that his wife had not only stolen from his mother but had then tried to convince everyone that his mother was mentally incompetent. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "I should have believed you. I should have helped you instead of assuming you were confused." The apology meant something, but it couldn't undo the damage of the past weeks, the humiliation of having my concerns dismissed, the isolation of being treated like a confused old woman, the grief of thinking I'd lost my wedding ring forever. After Diane left the office, Sandra and I sat together in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Relieved, validated, angry, grateful?" I looked down at my wedding ring, turning it slowly around my finger. For weeks, everyone was telling me I was confused, that grief was affecting my judgment. You believe. Me having the evidence prove I was right, it means everything. "Mrs. Callahan, I want you to know that what happened to you is unfortunately common. Family members often target elderly relatives because they assume the victims won't fight back or won't be believed. Your willingness to investigate and demand justice prevented Diane from continuing this pattern of behavior." "Done this before?" "Based on what we found in her financial records and online sales history. I suspect your ring wasn't the first valuable item she's taken from family members. But because you fought back, it will likely be the last." 6 months later, I was gardening in my backyard when Mrs. Chen from next door called over the fence. "Margaret, dear, how are you doing? You look wonderful." I straightened up from my roses, feeling the familiar pull of my wedding ring as I adjusted my gardening gloves. The weight of it on my finger had become precious to me in a new way since its recovery, not just a symbol of my marriage to James, but a reminder of my own strength and worth. "I'm doing well, Mrs. Chen. Very well, actually. I'm so glad to hear that. I've been meaning to tell you. I'm proud of how you handled that situation with your daughter-in-law. It takes courage to stand up for yourself like that." Mrs. Chen had been one of the few people who'd believed me from the beginning, who'd never suggested that my concerns about the missing ring were products of grief-induced confusion. Her faith in my competence had meant more than she knew. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. You're an inspiration to those of us who sometimes feel invisible because of our age. You proved that we don't have to accept being dismissed or taken advantage of. After Mrs. Chen went back to her own garden, I continued working among my roses, thinking about the past year, James's death, the theft and recovery of my ring, the painful revelation of Diane's true character, the slow rebuilding of my relationship with Michael. The investigation had revealed that Diane had been systematically taking advantage of elderly family members for years, using her position as a caring daughter-in-law to gain access to homes and possessions. My wedding ring had been just one item in a long pattern of theft that she'd disguised as concern for elderly relatives who didn't need their possessions anymore. Michael had filed for divorce. Within 2 months of discovering the truth about his wife's behavior, the process had been painful for everyone, especially my granddaughter Emma. But Michael had come to understand that he couldn't remain married to someone who viewed elderly family members as targets for exploitation. Mom, I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed your concerns or treated you like you couldn't handle things on your own, he'd said during one of our reconciliation conversations. I was so influenced by Diane's narrative about your supposed confusion that I stopped trusting your judgment. The important thing is that you learned from it, I'd replied, and that you'll never again assume that someone's age makes their concerns less valid. As I finished my gardening and went inside to wash up, I performed the familiar ritual of removing my wedding ring and placing it in the small ceramic dish by the kitchen sink. The routine that had been interrupted so traumatically had been restored, but it carried new meaning now. The ring wasn't just a symbol of my marriage to James anymore. It was also a symbol of my refusal to be victimized. My insistence on being treated with dignity and respect. My willingness to fight for what was rightfully mine regardless of what others thought about my age or my capabilities. That evening, I called Sandra Martinez to check on a case she was handling for another elderly woman whose family had been systematically stealing from her. Mrs. Chen is making excellent progress, Sandra reported. Having your case as precedent has been helpful in demonstrating that elderly victims can successfully fight against family theft. I'd become something of an informal advocate for other elderly people facing similar situations, sharing my story at senior centers and legal aid clinics to help others recognize the signs of financial abuse and understand that they had options for fighting back. The most important thing people need to understand, I told audiences, is that getting older doesn't make you less deserving of respect or less capable of standing up for yourself. When someone steals from you or tries to convince you that you're confused or incompetent, you have every right to demand justice. Before bed that night, sat in James's favorite chair and looked at the photos on our mantel, our wedding day, family vacations, holidays with Michael and Emma. In many of the photos, my wedding ring was visible, catching the light as I held James's hand or gestured at some long-forgotten joke. The ring had been through so much with us. 47 years of daily life, of love and loss and ordinary moments that had made up our extraordinary marriage. It had survived James's death and my grief, Diane's theft and manipulation, the legal battle for its recovery. It had become more than a symbol of my marriage. It was a symbol of my resilience, my refusal to be diminished by those who underestimated me. As I prepared for bed, I went through my evening routine with renewed appreciation for its familiar rhythms. I removed my wedding ring and placed it in the ceramic dish by the kitchen sink, where it would wait safely until morning. Tomorrow I would put it on again, and the day after that, and for as many days as I was blessed to have. The ring would continue to remind me not just of my love for James, but of my love for myself, my worth, my dignity, my right to be treated with respect, regardless of my age. It would remind me that I was not a confused old woman whose concerns could be dismissed, but a competent adult who deserved to have her possessions and her autonomy protected. Some people might say that a wedding ring is just jewelry. That's sentimental. Value is less important than practical considerations. That elderly widows should focus on the future instead of clinging to the past. But those people would be wrong. My wedding ring wasn't just jewelry, was a repository of memory and love. A tangible connection to the most important relationship of my life, a symbol of promises kept and trust honored. It was irreplaceable, not because of its monetary value, but because of its emotional significance. And I was not a confused old woman whose attachments could be dismissed as pathetic sentimentality. I was a 74-year-old woman who had loved deeply, grieved honestly, and fought successfully for what was rightfully mine. I was someone who refused to be invisible, discounted, or victimized because of my age. The theft of my wedding ring had been a violation of my trust, my home, and my heart. But recovering it had been a validation of my worth, my competence, and my right to be treated with dignity. In fighting for my ring, I had fought for myself, and I had one. Now I'm curious about you who have followed my story to the end. Have you ever had someone dismiss your concerns because of your age? Have you watched family members treat elderly relatives as if their attachments and possessions didn't matter? What would you do if someone stole something irreplaceable from you and then tried to convince everyone that you were too confused to know what had happened? Comment below and let me know what city you're reading from, so I can see how far my story has reached. And remember, your age doesn't diminish your worth or your right to be treated with respect. Your sentimental attachments aren't pathetic, they're precious. Your concerns aren't confusion, they're wisdom earned through experience. Fighting for your dignity at any age isn't just possible, it's necessary. Standing up for yourself when others try to diminish you isn't selfish shit survival. I'm living proof that you're never too old to demand justice, and you're never too powerless to win.